Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week, it's Halloween!
It's Halloween! Woo!
It's Halloween, and so we are doing something a little bit unusual. We are taking two stories, which are published quite a bit apart, actually. They're oddities, I would say.
They are very un-Christie-like Christie short stories.
Very un-Christie-like. So we're going to have a little bit of a hard time dissecting them like we might normally. But I think that they're going to be fun to talk about regardless.
We're going to have some ghoulish fun is what we're going to have.
On that note, we'll start with The Dressmaker's Doll, and it was first published in 1958, so we're way out of our normal timeline here.
Yeah.
And it was, interestingly enough, published in Canada's Star Weekly, which is a little interesting. And then, more typically, it was published in June of 1959 in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine in the United States.
So first published in Canada, and then next published in the U.S.,
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, I don't know, Americans in particular love their spooky dolls, but I'm really not basing that on anything. So let's move on to the victim. Or the victims, really, because you could say the victim is the world in this case, actually.
Well, I suppose. If you believe anything that happens in this story, then I suppose we should all be terrified.
So the victims are the employees of this dressmaker's shop where ladies go to buy fancy dresses. In particular, the owner of the shop, who is Miss Alicia Coombe. Her shop is apparently being taken over by a possessed doll, so she is the primary victim, let us say.
If we believe that.
If we believe that, that is what's happening.
If we don't, then the suspects are Miss Alicia Coombe herself, who's the proprietress of the shop, and she's a clothing designer would be the wrong term for what she is. She's literally a dressmaker. Fancy ladies come in and she fits wardrobes for them.
Right, but she does design dresses, right? Because she, at one point, laments that she can't concentrate enough to do her newest designs.
Right, but she's a dressmaker in the classical sense.
Right.
In like a tailor, like a Savile Row tailor.
Right, she's not
a designer.
She's not Versace or
Christian Dior.
Right, high-end kind of designer. Sure. Next, we have Miss Sybil Fox, who is, I don't think she really has an actual title in the shop.
No.
But she's like the second in command. She seems to be Alicia Coombe's confidant and business friend.
Consigliere with like the rest of the staff.
Yeah.
And then we have Mrs. Groves, who is the cleaning lady. She happens to actually be in a lot of the story, but it's mostly to provide color commentary while she's on her hands and knees, like crab walking, which like I have to say in a sort of spooky story, by crab walking, I think that Christie means that she was literally just backing up on her hands and knees. But it does come up in this, and I was just picturing her backwards Exorcist.
Yeah, I mean, since this is the Halloween episode, let's just bring up the iconic Exorcist scene in which Linda Blair crab walks.
So I'm just picturing Mrs. Groves doing that.
With like a bottle of Windex.
Oh my gosh, and a feather duster, yeah.
Rounding out our cast of suspects here are the seamstresses in the dress shop. Their names are Elspeth, Margaret, and Marlene. And
Elspeth seems like a Halloween episode name.
So let's talk about the world as it appears to be, because the world appears to be a pretty spooky place in this story, and perhaps is a spooky place. Yeah, so there's this doll. And the doll shows up in the fitting rooms of this posh dressmaker, Miss Alicia Coombe, and nobody quite remembers why or when she arrived. Everyone thinks the doll is really creepy. She's dressed in a gray-green outfit that matches the decor of the fitting room to the point where it almost appears like she was made for the room and that she belongs to the room, or perhaps that the room belongs to her.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah.
So at first the doll is just like creepily lounging on one side of the sofa.
And she really is lounging. There's a lot of
Yes.
descriptions of this doll lolling about on cushions with her long, loose limbs just kind of casually draped
Dangling,
over.
yeah.
And dangling. It's really creepy. It's actually, I mean, Christie does not get credit for being scary because she's normally not scary. You know, people mischaracterize her as cozy in that she's not, and that's part of the purpose of this podcast is to dispel that fiction. But
right, but you know, she's suspenseful, which
Sure.
can be scary in its own way. But she's not a jump scare
right, and this
person, if that makes sense.
This is horror scary. I was
Yes.
very much creeped out by her descriptions of the doll in various positions in this fitting room in this dressmaker shop.
Right. So a client is the first person to even notice it, and Alicia and Sybil are like, "Oh yeah, huh? That doll, huh? Yeah. When did that doll? Where did we get that doll from?"
And no one knows.
And nobody remembers.
This to me is more textbook Christie. In the beginning, it's, where did that pop up? I'm sure it popped up somewhere. It's a doll, who cares? And everyone is just kind of absent-minded about it. But the fact that no one can remember how it actually came about becomes increasingly creepy and unsettling as the story goes on.
Here's where it gets worse, because the doll moves.
Mm-hmm.
Not when anybody's watching, but when people leave the room, the doll has suddenly gone from lolling on the sofa to sitting with her doll hands on the writing desk.
Oof, what is that doll writing? I don't want to know.
I don't want to know either.
Oh, come on, hon. Don't be so grouchy.
I'm not being grouchy. I just want to finish my work.
Okay, I understand. I'll come back later on with a couple of sandwiches for you, and maybe you'll let me read something then.
Wendy, let me explain something to you. Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me, and it will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
Yeah?
All work and no play make Doll Jack a dull girl, perhaps? I don't know.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it really does seem, well, I mean, she doesn't have a typewriter, so she'd have to be like clawing it into the wood of the desk.
Which is even creepier, yeah.
Yes.
So, of course, Sybil and Alicia suspect the seamstresses, these three women who are upstairs and working away, poor ladies, on various dresses, and they insist that they have nothing to do with it, and it gets very awkward because it's very obvious very quickly that Sybil thinks they're lying, and they're indignant. Like, no, we're not lying. We had nothing to do with this doll. So Sybil then begins to lock the fitting room door when she goes home, and even with the fitting room door locked each day, the doll still shows up either at the desk or sitting on the window seat facing the window and looking at the outside world. It doesn't solve things, certainly. It just sort of escalates them because no one else seems to have a key, and then they even end up doing this search for potentially other keys within the building that might be used to fit that block. That doesn't really turn up anything, so it all just kind of escalates the tension here because it's just very unclear how this doll is moving.
Right, and to the point where Mrs. Grove, who is the aforementioned cleaning lady, she literally, like, stops cleaning the room.
Yeah.
You know, she doesn't say so, but they know that she's not even cleaning the room anymore.
She's the smart person in the horror movie who's like, nope.
Nope.
That's a hard pass.
I'm out. Also, kind of really prototypical horror story, Sybil and Alicia start questioning what they're seeing, and they legitimately consider involving a psychic society. Right.
This is also what I think is so skillful about the story. Everything that they do is what I would do. Or at least I'm made to feel like that as I'm reading it. Their reactions to everything are eminently reasonable and understandable. And it reminded me actually of a recent iconic horror series.
My girlfriend Katie, she thinks there's something in the house. I don't know.
You believe me, right?
Paranormal Activity, which fell off the rails as most series do, but the first one was effective because you're watching this couple who are increasingly realizing that there is a demon possessing something or someone in their midst, and the ways that they react to it feel so true, and that makes it scary. And I felt the same way with Alicia and Sybil. They're so rational, and they just get kind of sucked into this eminently irrational situation, but I'm there with them, you know? When they said calling psychicide, I was like, but they don't want to, because they're like, that's ridiculous. This is this.
Well, I mean, we should bring this up at this point, since you brought up a Paranormal Activity, which is I think another Blumhouse movie.
True.
Or,
absolutely Blumhouse.
We should bring up.
Sometimes demons can attach themselves to objects.
Protect your family.
The Conjuring and Annabelle, because they are just like huge blockbusters in the U.S. and based sort of on a true story about the Warrens, who were famous paranormal investigators in like the 1960s and 70s.
Right.
But that also is definitely about a haunted doll.
Right. The Conjuring was the original movie, right? And that was about this couple. And then they owned various objects that had been said to be possessed or just harbor supernatural powers of some sort. And one of them was this doll named Annabelle, who makes an appearance in The Conjuring, and then was such a hit that there was the movie Annabelle, and then most recently Annabelle Creation. She got 2 movies. And that one goes back to the 60s, I think. I did not see it, I have to admit, but people loved it. People were scared by it because that doll is creepy.
I hear about these things from my sister. Shout out to Elizabeth. I do not watch these things myself, but
do you not watch them because they're too scary for you, or they're just not for you?
I am not a giant horror movie fan.
Interesting. Why not?
I don't like jump scares.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of problems, I think, with a lot of the choices made in them from a plot perspective. There are some really good lit theory books that discuss horror movies. And if you think about horror movies and the idea of things like, you know, the male gaze and predation, they operate at a really interesting level. And so they're interesting at some ways from like a theory perspective.
They're probably the most nakedly visceral of genres for both good and bad, right?
Oh, no, I agree. There's a really, really wonderful book if anybody wants to just be a giant weird nerd. It's a pretty famous book. It's called Men, Women, and Chainsaws. It's a theory book from like the 1980s. And it really, really delves into the construction of horror movies and how we viscerally respond to them. It's really interesting. I find them interesting to talk about. I don't find them enjoyable at all to watch.
Yeah, fair enough. I understand that too, and it's funny, and I think we've had this conversation before, but I don't believe we've had it before on the podcast. I feel that I'm one of the few persons in Western civilization at this point who does not watch Game of Thrones, because I cannot handle the sort of torture porn and pain porn aspect of...
You know, I would say that, weirdly enough, that doesn't bother me on Game of Thrones so much as it does on something like Outlander that I stopped watching for a while because it felt like too intimate.
I think it would bother me in Outlander too, which is also the reason that I haven't watched Outlander. But it doesn't bother me in horror movies because I feel like there's a contract being made with me as a viewer that this is not real. And that's part of the contrivances of the plot actually help me in that respect, because I'm never made to feel as if anyone is actually being hurt, and I'm never emotionally invested in it to the point where I feel uncomfortable. And with something like Game of Thrones, I know that I would be. And same thing with Outlanders, which is why I avoid those, but I'm not really bothered by horror.
That's interesting. I would not say to me that horror or like creepy doll things or something as a genre are like super traumatizing.
Sure.
If you're going to talk about like narratives that get really upsetting, I mean, people point to like Game of Thrones and their depictions of things like sexual assault and how people are, you know, triggered in some way, I guess, by that. For me, it's like a show that has like a bunch of dragons and weird magic and people.
And I can get that too. For whatever reason, that doesn't pierce the veil for me, but I get that it would for you or for someone else.
But I mean, I would say that I remember being in, I think, high school when the episode of The Sopranos came out where Dr. Melfi gets raped in a parking garage. Mm-hmm. And for me, that remains a far more viscerally traumatic fictional viewing experience than anything that happened on Game of Thrones.
Oh yeah, The Sopranos it's a great example because I think The Sopranos there are no elements to The Sopranos that are softening the edges of these are real people and this is something like this is stuff that happens to real people and you should be emotionally invested in this. So it's going to be upsetting.
Correct. And so when you have that versus the idea of a horror movie, and and I think, and this is an interesting Christie point, because when we talk about some of these books and we talk about the criticism of Christie about cardboard characters, as an example, I think that we talk a lot about how that's not really true in a lot of the books, but in the ones where it is true, you do lose some investment about the fact that people are murdered.
Sure.
So there is something to be said about, when you have something that feels grounded or current or fleshed out, it's more impactful than if you just have a Saw movie that, you can't even remember any of the people's names before they're pulled apart.
Absolutely. And then obviously our larger argument is that people just paint Christie with too wide of a brush and say all of her novels are like that, and that just obviously is not true because there are so many of the novels where you are invested and you are not only entertained but you're there with these people.
Right, and so like if we have ranked still, even in our year-long re-rank, we've still ranked Murder of Roger Ackroyd the highest, and I think part of that is because of the creepy factor. Mm-hmm. It's why it actually makes it a fairly compelling reread, because you're so compelled by the narration of it that when you know where that narration is going, it makes it all the worse.
Yep. Creepiness is endemic, I think, to a lot of Christie, a lot more so than she gets credit for. It was why I, at least, enjoyed 3-Act Tragedy so much upon the reread, because I think there was a lot of creepiness in watching Sir Charles wend his way through that story, knowing exactly what was going on in his head the whole time. And there's often a creepiness factor in the unmasking of any murderer. And, sometimes in some of them it works better than others, but it is creepy to have that moment of they've been pretending this whole time and now they're being shown for who they are. And if done right, and it is often done right, it is legitimately creepy.
I love cemeteries. Like, I love walking through cemeteries, and I got that from my mom, who thinks that they're interesting as a history source, and that she thinks, like, they can be beautiful spots, which they are. Mm-hmm. But when we were kids, she used to say, you shouldn't be scared of going into a cemetery. You should be respectful. Don't be scared of the dead. Be scared of the living. Which, is really a big Christie point, I think. And so it's also why the sort of supernatural, spooky stories don't really do that much for me. Whereas if you have, like, a psychopath... Right.
Well, Mama Brobeck kept it real. Shout out.
Brobeck definitely keeps it real.
We're shouting out to all of Catherine's family here. We're going to have to shout out to your dad at some point so he doesn't feel left out. Well, going back to the Dressmaker's doll, I think what's different here is that in most other Christie stories, the creepiness is incidental to the main affair, right? Which is a murder. Correct. And the solving of a murder. What's so unusual about the story is that the creepiness is the main affair here. Yes. I mean, this is just a story meant to creep you out, and it certainly creeped me out. And that's pretty much it. And on that note, let's continue with what happens here with poor Alicia Coombe and Sybil Fox. Not that much more happens. They lock the room. Right. Well, they lock the room. What I love, too, is that then this escalation also, to me, is so what I would have also done. Alicia Coombe is like, you know what? I'm just not going to go in there anymore. She's just like, I give up the room. And it's like, they only have like 2 rooms, I think. I think they have the fitting room and then another room, and then they have the upstairs, right? So that's at least like a quarter of their offices that they're paying rent on, I assume, if not a mortgage, whatever. And she's like, you know what? The doll can have it. We're just never go. And Sybil's like, wait, you're never going in there again? She's like, nope.
Never again. It's fine. Like, it's totally okay. Like,
it's kind of funny.
It goes that way for quite some time. And Sybil eventually is like, the moths are going to have eaten the furniture.
Right.
Like, we have to go in there.
We have to at least see what's going on, in there.
So they open the door, and it's totally clean.
Which is even creepier.
It's even creepier,
it's spotless. And the doll is sitting on the sofa
sitting
upright.
in the middle of the sofa.
Basically, like as one would sit to receive guests.
And they're basically like, well, the room's hers now. We out. So they relock the door.
Yep.
But I guess now that the doll has seen that they've seen, the doll has other intentions.
Right, Alicia's like, I knew that this would happen if you opened the door. Now she's gotten out of her room and she's going into our room because she then ends up in the new fitting room.
She does. She just shows up in there. Out of her locked parlor, she shows up in the new fitting room. Right.
And at that point, poor Alicia Coombe has had it. So in a fit of pique, we could say, she opens a window.
Well, they talk about burning it too.
Right, they do. They talk about burning it. I like the fact that Christie makes them consider all of the extreme possibilities, like going to a psychic or burning it, and they just don't want to do any of that because it's kind of giving into
too crazy.
Yeah, it's giving into the insanity of what they find themselves in. So she basically just in a very short-tempered kind of a way flings open a window and then flings the doll out onto the pavement, and Sybil is horrified. I think you can kind of tell in Sybil's mind, she's like, oh, now you've done it. now it's really on.
And the doll's like face down on the pavement, like far beneath them.
And they're watching from on high as this little street urchin girl approaches the doll, and they're basically like, no!
Don't do it. Don't touch the doll. Get away from the doll. Like screaming out the window.
Yep.
And so they run down the stairs.
Yeah. And it takes them a while to get to the ground. So by the time they get there, of course, this girl is holding the doll. They follow her onto a traffic island in the middle of the street. I was convinced at this point, I was like, oh, someone's getting run over. Maybe all of them are getting run over.
I thought so too.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I thought reading it.
You could take that fake apology and shove it right up your hairy...
And that's how Regina George died. No, I'm totally kidding. But she did get hurt.
If this was like Annabelle Part 3, The Reckoning.
Annabelle Part 3, Final Destination.
Right. Even more Annabelle-ier.
Right.
They would get run over by a truck.
But they don't. Instead, they have a confrontation with this small child on a traffic island.
Mm-hmm.
And so 2 older women basically try to rip the doll away from her while she tells them off.
Yep.
What she essentially says to them is, I watched you throw her out the window. You do not love her. I love her. And you're bad people who threw her out the window when all she wants is to be loved. So screw you. And then she runs off into traffic again.
Right. And disappears.
And disappears.
And that is the end of the story, my friends.
So the world as it actually is, as far as we are aware, is that dolls are really creepy and possessed.
Whenever we are confronted by a seemingly supernatural event in a Christie story, we say, well, this is Agatha Christie, and supernatural events don't happen except for the Mystery of the Blue Train. And now also except for the Dressmaker's doll, because I think this doll was really possessed. There are no clues laid in here as to who may have actually been moving the doll.
None.
We're not meant to believe that anyone was moving the doll or there was an ulterior motive here. If anything, the one twist I think we can read into this story in the end, which is interesting, is this idea that from the beginning, these women all perceived this doll to be creepy and evil.
Right.
And it took the innocence of a child to say, no, you have it all the wrong way around. This doll just wants to be loved. You're the creepy, evil people.
Although Although I will be honest, that's also the premise of every horror story involving a doll, is that the child is like, no, this lovely doll that like I really want to love, and then the doll turns out to be,
Right. But the idea that the evil or the horror is from within and not actually coming from the object that seems to be horrible is also such a standard horror trope. I love that Twilight Zone episode where there's a woman who everyone's talking about how hideous she is and how she needs to get an operation because she basically has to get reconstructive surgery.
I just wanted people not to scream when they looked at me. When, nurse? When will I take the bandages off?
And it's only at the end that you see the woman, and of course she's beautiful, and then you see the nurses and the doctor, and they have these pig snouts, and they're hideously ugly. So I kind of love the idea that perhaps they were wrong all the time, and they were looking at this just all wrong.
That or they gave an urchin girl
a demon doll.
Demon doll.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she's now going to like rule the world as her demon minion. Yep.
Yeah, yep. A possibility.
No adaptations of that, although, as we said, the doll horror genre, we mentioned Annabelle, and we also would be remiss, I think, as children of the 80s, at least I'm a bit more of a child of the 80s than Catherine, to not mention...
A good guy! I knew it! I knew you'd get me one!
Show me how he works, okay?
Hi, I'm Andy. What's your name? Hi, I'm Chucky. And I'm your friend to the end. Heidi-ho.
Wow, he's something, isn't he?
The Child's Play franchise, Chucky.
Well, and not
doll.
only that, but there's a brand new one that just came out.
There's a new Chucky that came out?
There is. The last two, and I say this as something of a bias because I think the actress in them is wonderful. I might be biased because I might be friends with her.
Oh, okay.
But they've sort of revamped it. And the thing about those Child's Play movies is that the last one was legitimately really scary. It went from campy to scary again.
Jesus, the music scene's gone to hell since I've been dead.
Chucky's still Chucky, but they have really good continuity for horror franchises. I will say that. It's been very, very consistent for like 30 years.
So doll horror subgenre, who knew? But lots to unearth there. Seriously.
Indeed.
So let's switch gears now and discuss our second story, which is also appropriate for Halloween, but could not be more different in pretty much all ways. Starting with when it was published, Catherine Brobeck, tell us a little bit about the publication history of Philomel Cottage.
So it was published in November of 1924 in the Graham magazine, which we have not actually come across at this point, I don't think.
No, this is within Agatha Christie's amazingly fertile period where she seems to have written 25 short stories a year. Within the 20s.
Right.
Yeah.
It gets published again in a collection in 1934 called The Listerdale Mystery, which is also a little bit of an oddity because it doesn't come up that often.
Aren't there some Miss Marples in The Listerdale Mystery, I think?
There are a bunch of things in it.
Yeah,
it's a
potpourri.
Collection.
Yeah.
Even weirder, this story's been adapted a ton of times.
Yeah. Well, it was adapted first as a play, right?
Mm-hmm. Correct. Called Love from a Stranger.
Love from a Stranger. And then that play was subsequently adapted for film, both feature and TV. Many
And
many times.
And radio.
And radio, yeah. Including a very early adaptation starring none other than Basil Rathbone. We weren't able to watch any of those films. I believe that perhaps that early Basil Rathbone may be available somewhere. We were not able to get our hands on it or any of the others, so we're going to not discuss any of the adaptations and just talk about, I was going to say table that discussion, but let's be honest, we're not going to discuss this again.
We're not going to table it. Yeah, this is a one and done on Philomel Cottage.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about this one.
So who's the victim, Kemper?
Yeah, we can't really tell you who the victim is because that is going to give away the plot. And again, just like with the Dressmaker's doll, our usual breakdown of the story doesn't really make sense because there are no clues, and the way that the world appears to be is kind of the way that the world actually is, at least as it develops over the course of the story. So again, let's not talk about a victim, let's not talk about suspects, let's just get into what is going on here, because this is a thriller horror setup that is going to be very familiar.
Yes, and like the doll thing, the premise here is just repeated in like horror movies and psychological thrillers galore. Yeah. So Alex Martin she's a typist. She's a spinster in her 30s. She's not necessarily unattractive. I think that it's described that she's neither beautiful nor really pretty, but at the same time, it's not like she's ugly. She has brown hair, and she's like appealing in her way, I guess. Right. And for a very long time, she was pursued by this man named Dick Winford, and he was a clerk in her office, so a coworker. They really liked each other, but I guess he didn't have the money, and he was supporting other family members, so he was essentially a bachelor, and she didn't have any money, and so they were unable to marry.
They were kind of dancing around a romantic entanglement, but they never really pulled the trigger on it.
Correct.
For, I think, 11 years, something like that. So Alex all of a sudden receives an inheritance that allows her to quit her job from, I believe, a distant family member, a very unexpected windfall. And at the same time, coincidentally, or is it, she falls for a stranger named Gerald Martin. And almost immediately, they get married. Much to the violent chagrin of Dick Winford, they get married because he, of course, has been in love with her for these 11 years.
Right.
And Alex and Gerald move to this rural home, the titular Philomel Cottage, which is a rather idyllic place to live, it seems.
Disregarding Mr. Winford, they seem relatively happy in the month that they're there. But after that first month of postnuptial bliss,
Alex seems to have dreams about Dick Winford. In every dream, he shows up to rescue her from an increasingly sinister Gerald Martin, who he presumably kills. But the really weird thing about these dreams is that in the dream, Alex is happy that Dick Winford has showed up and saved her from Gerald Martin. She is on Dick's side as opposed to her own husband's. And she wakes up, and this is all very confusing because, of course, she loves her husband. And it's sad that things didn't work out with Dick, but she's now with Gerald, and she doesn't understand why she keeps on having these dreams. And then to make matters worse, one day in the village, which is a little bit a ways from Philomel Cottage, so Philomel Cottage is a little isolated, that may be important later on. Alex runs into Dick himself, and he invites himself over for dinner, and she refuses and offends him, and then she sort of tries to invite him like another night, and he's like, no, it's fine, whatever. I'm so happy for you. Your married life.
Right, and it's a little bit weird that he shows up in the village, because it's very much noted that it's in the middle of nowhere, and he says that he's going to go meet a buddy on a trip.
He seems to be
stalking her, probably.
Yeah, a little bit. Given the fact that she's married, this seems like inappropriate behavior.
So she goes home, and she runs into two things. One is she finds her husband's pocket notebook on the ground, and so she pockets it. And at the same time, she runs into their gardener, who's this man named George, and he's come on the wrong day. It's Wednesday rather than Friday, because he wants to go to, apparently, a party.
Right, a local fete, I believe, as it's pronounced.
Yes, and so he basically is like, oh, well, you don't mind, right? And she's like, no, I don't mind, but then he gets into a long conversation with her. The first thing that he says is that he ran into Gerald in town, and Gerald insisted that, oh, well, they were off to London for a few days, which is very, very confusing to Alex because, of course, she never wants to go to London again. She wants to live in the country and forget her previous life, so of course she's not going to London. Then the second thing is, which seems really inappropriate at this point, by the way, George the gardener says that the cottage costs £2,000. And so we get into this weird segue where we find out that the cottage Alex has paid for.
Right. She had to pay for it with some of her inheritance. Mm-hmm. And she was told by Gerald, since this is 1924, so unfortunately the business transaction seems to have happened between two men, even though this is Alex's money. She is told by Gerald that it costs $3,000, not $2,000.
Correct. And Gerald has some money, but I guess his funds weren't liquid. They were in stocks. And she has transferable funds.
The gardener, you can tell, is kind of like, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. She shouldn't worry her pretty little head about money matters. And she's like, oh, he's just an old doddering idiot. He's wrong. And I'm sure he's just misunderstanding something.
Right.
But she's perturbed by the whole thing and becomes a little bit paranoid, understandably so. And she checks out that pocket notebook that she had found on the ground, wherein Gerald writes down every detail of his life. He seems to be rather persnickety gentleman. And at 9 p.m. that night, he has a scheduled appointment, but no details for that appointment.
Right.
It just notes the time, 9 p.m., nothing else. And she clocks that and becomes even more weirded out by that. So when Gerald comes home, she asks him about this house payment, and he says, oh, well, you know, it was $2,000 in cash, and then the other $1,000 had to be mortgaged, so that's probably why the gardener was confused, and that kind of lines up with what she was thinking, that he didn't really know what he was talking about, so that kind of makes her feel okay. But
and then he says that the trip to London is a joke.
Right, that he made a joke and the gardener misunderstood him. And then the mysterious 9 p.m. appointment, he says that he wanted to develop photos in his dark room at 9 p.m. and that he actually needed her help, but he then decides that he's not going to actually do it that night, and he says that he'll do it some other time. He just seems a little out of sorts about the fact that the gardener had told her about the London thing, even though it didn't make sense, and he's just perturbed about the whole conversation.
He doesn't even really seem out of sorts. He seems irate.
Yeah, he gets furious at the fact that the gardener said anything to her.
Right. That's not a good sign, usually.
No.
The next day, Alex is now super paranoid, if she wasn't already, and she decides to go through all of Gerald's stuff. She finds, like, his keys. She goes through his desk drawers. There's nothing suspicious, really, except, like, you know, she finds, like, he saved love letters from her, which seems really nice. But then she finds another key that's not on his keychain, but, like, it's a matching key to a wardrobe with a locked drawer. And there's a roll of, like, dusty newspaper clippings about a notorious wife murderer named Lemaitre.
Yep, that's right.
Apparently, this Lemaitre fake married a bunch of ladies. He killed them, and then he buried their bodies in the basements of their homes. And while there's not a photograph, the newspaper sketches that are there, guess who they look an awfully lot like?
Could it be Gerald? And then lo and behold, she sees Gerald coming home with a shovel. So frantically, Alex just tries to book it, which is totally what I would have done in that situation too. She just tries to run away, but unfortunately Gerald spots her, and we mentioned Philomel Cottage is several miles from town, so it's not like she can just start running. He would catch up to her. So she has to pretend that everything's cool and that she just kind of wanted to take a walk. And he's like, oh, I'll go for a walk with you. He perhaps senses that something is up. He will not leave her side. He follows her into the kitchen. He follows her down the lane. He follows her into the living room. They eat the meal that Alex had prepared previously, and she just cannot shake him. So finally, as she's at wit's end, it's after dinner, and she says that she has to call the butcher about a delivery the next day.
Right.
And what she does is that she knows that trustee Dick Wintford is still at the inn, the local inn, so she calls the inn. She gets Dick on the phone, and she speaks to him in what is essentially code, where she says a message that could ostensibly be for the butcher, but mutes any of the butcher-specific elements, so that what Dick Wintford is hearing basically is, help, please come, life or death, essentially. Right. And she thinks that she's gotten away with it, that Gerald didn't suspect, because Gerald, of course, is listening on the other end. That's why this whole code thing is necessary. And she's very pleased with herself for having done this, and she just hopes that Gerald can get there in time, because
Gerald wants to go back to the basement. And
this was, I thought, the best moment of the short story. She assumes that it's another 9 p.m. appointment, right, and it's 8:25, so she's like, oh, I'm good.
Have half an hour.
Yeah, Dick's got 35 minutes, and Gerald then sips his coffee for 5 minutes. He's like, well, time to go down to the basement. And she's like,
I scheduled this for specifically 8:30.
Yeah, it's 8:30, not 9. And she's like, crap.
Yeah, and in the interim, he's berated her for his bad taste in coffee.
Yes, he says the coffee tastes bad, and she's like, oh, it's a new brand or a new variety. He starts getting increasingly aggressive with her, saying no, they have to.
Yeah,
they have
physical and like in her face about needing to go to the basement.
And Alex, understandably, is freaking out. So she essentially pulls what I would call a Scheherazade, where her life is in danger. So she's like, let me tell you a story. And she's like, I have a confession to make. So that interests him. And Gerald sits back down.
Does sit back down, and she begins to narrate that she hadn't told him something. That, in fact, she'd been married twice before, and that both those husbands had died. And, it looked like a heart attack, but actually, she'd killed them with a poison called hyoscine. And so he starts to freak out, at which point there is a knock on the door.
By the way, we did, in all fairness, there was one detail that we failed to mention when we are supplied it as readers, which is that when she's looking at those insane newspaper clippings, not only do they go into the wife-killing activities of Lamette, but they also mention casually that he has a heart condition.
Right, yeah. Right, correct. They do.
That this wife-killer guy who didn't serve much time and is out has, and no one really knows where he is, that he has a heart condition. Right. Just FYI.
At this point, Gerald is like turning bright red and trying to like lunge at her.
She runs out, and it's Dick. It's her beloved, and she faints in his arms. But guess what? She didn't need to be saved because girlfriend saved herself. Because
died of a heart attack.
Gerald of the weak heart, Lamette, indeed, died of a heart attack induced by the lies, or were they?
Or were they?
That Alex Martin told him. And that's what's really interesting. I mean, the twist ending here, which, discarding the extra twist that we could put on it, which we'll deal with in a second, but just the mere twist that she used his own past offensively and just said, well, you killed your wives. Well, I had a bunch of husbands and I killed them, and now I'm going to kill you. And gave him a heart attack. That's pretty awesome and clever. But the deeper layer here, which there's nothing that is denying this deeper reading of the story, is that she actually did have other husbands and kill them, and she just killed this guy too.
Definite possibility. I mean, we don't know. I mean, like we literally don't know. I mean, the only tell against that would be that we know that Dick has known her for that long.
Sure.
And so, presumably we wouldn't know that if she'd been married several times. That's the biggest clue that what she does is in fact just really smart.
Yeah. And it's very clever. The movie that I thought of, and I think most people would think of immediately, because it's probably still the most famous example of this setup.
There was something strange about Johnny Aisgar. I knew it long before I married him. Thing you could put your finger on, and yet you were always conscious of it. Conscious of something vague, restless, and frightening. There was our first meeting on the hilltop.
What did you think I'd do? Kill you?
Suspicion, the Hitchcock thriller. Yeah. Rebecca is kind of a variant on it as well, but there's a lot more going on in Rebecca. Suspicion is much more this specific concept. And of course, spoiler alert, since this is not a Christie story, so if you haven't watched Suspicion, stop this episode, go watch it, and come back. But the twist there is that the husband is actually, who seems to be a killer, is good. It was a misperception.
The one that I think is that it's not a husband-wife story, but the one that struck me is actually maybe my favorite Hitchcock movie.
Oh, let me go, Uncle Charlie! Let me go!
It's Shadow of a Doubt.
I thought of Shadow of a Doubt, too. I love that one.
I love Shadow of a Doubt. She's convinced that her uncle, young Charlie, is convinced that Uncle Charlie is in fact the Merry Widow murderer. Right. And guess what? He is the Merry Widow murderer. That's exactly who he is.
There's something more disturbing about the relationship being an uncle and niece possibly just because of the incestuous...
Well, it's really sexualized in Shadow of a Doubt.
It's very sexualized. Well, because she's a young woman and he's a handsome, debonair uncle, and it's totally sexualized. There was a movie that was so in the debt of Shadow of a Doubt that came out a couple of years ago, written by the guy from Prison Break, Wentworth Miller, and I think Park Chan-wook.
Stoker?
Yes, Stoker, which was also a niece-uncle incestuous thing going on there, and it's a lot more twisted.
With very handsome Matthew Good, I might know.
Yes, that one's a lot more twisted. In the Hitchcock original, young Charlie, the niece, is merely an agent for good. I actually love that movie so much. I recently rewatched it. Here's the one bummer of that movie, at least upon a recent viewing. It heavily features a child actress who is Charlie's younger sister.
Yes.
And she is so annoying because she has that fake actory way. You know, that's the way that they were encouraged to act in movies from that time, and it's really distracting and it pulls you out of the movie. And she's in it a lot more than I ever remembered. But other than that, the suspense part of it absolutely holds up. It's such a good movie.
Hume Cronin is the neighbor who's really good. All of those neighbor details, like the community there, is really good. You know, they're in Santa Rosa, right? That's where... And so, I mean, all of the details about, like, the little community, like, Charlie...
the details of the community are
Charlie
fantastic.
Going to the library is, like, a really, really great detail in it.
It's one of those movies that it wasn't meaning to be a time capsule of small-town life in, like, the late 30s or early 40s, whenever it was made. But
early 40s.
But because they weren't meaning to be a time capsule, it's actually one of the best time capsules of that. It's of, like, this little Americana kind of thing. It's great. The town details are awesome. The other book that I thought of and that I wanted to reference because I think there are a lot of listeners who would appreciate it, and I read it recently, is a mystery novel written by a little-known female author of the Golden Age named Ethelina White, and she is most famous for writing the novella upon which another Hitchcock movie, this is a very early Hitchcock when he was still in the UK, The Lady Vanishes, is based on. Okay. Which is also another fantastic Hitchcock, which was much more recently adapted as...
Every one of my flight attendants are looking for a child that none of them believe was ever on board.
Who's she talking to?
We're not going to discuss this in the middle of the carriage.
Where's my daughter? Where is she? Where is she?
According to the director at the morgue, your daughter died 6 days ago.
What?
Our air marshal is going to escort you back to your seat.
You know she's alive. You know she's on this plane.
Why didn't anybody see her?
I don't know.
Flight Plan, starring Jodie Foster. But in any case, Ethelina White also wrote this novella called Some Must Watch, which was made into the classic movie The Spiral Staircase, which is one of the creepier old movies that I have ever seen. And that story basically follows this young servant girl who lives in an isolated estate in the countryside, and the estate and the surrounding town have been besieged by a psychopath. And the psychopath has already strangled a couple of women to death. It is so claustrophobically written, and the suspense in it is so, at moments, just so difficult to handle, even though it has parts of it that are not very well written either. You can sort of get a sense as to why Ethelina White didn't necessarily survive the test of time, but it has a similar in the isolation and the kind of paternalistic relationship that's going on between her and some of the other members of this household and how that eventually devolves. It has a lot of the bones of this kind of a setup, because to me the power of this setup and why there have been so many iterations of it over the years is the vulnerability of it.
You mentioned Rebecca, but I mean it's Rebecca and it's Jane Eyre to an extent. There's a gothic horror to that too.
There's a real gothic element to it. To be clear, we're not saying that Christie invented this either with this story, but it's a really early example of it.
Yeah, it's an effective story because even if you think that there is a twist, which you can read it in a way that she's Scheherazading and that it's not actually a twist, she's just doing an incredibly smart thing. Even straightforward, it's compelling.
Yeah, well, because I love the idea that no matter how you read that ending, the twist is that she ends up turning the tables.
Yeah, of course.
However
way
thoroughly
that
you want to take that, she does turn the tables, and that is a satisfying ending. to bring up another classic.
She is blind, and she is alone, with a terrible suspicion growing.
Wait Until Dark. You know, in that final scene, it's like, lights out, tables turned. Guess who's in trouble now? Not the blind lady. It's what makes those final scenes so gripping and then satisfying, you know, where things seem to be getting worse and worse and worse, and then the victim turns it around.
But ultimately, that is the tradition of horror movies. The final girl almost always ends up getting away through
but she doesn't always get away
intimate.
by turning the tables.
Well, you know what?
She gets away just by getting away.
No, I disagree with that. I think that in a lot of cases, especially in good horror movies, that is how the heroine gets away.
I guess, but like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, she certainly doesn't turn the tables. She just gets away.
Doesn't she bring in one of the family members? So she uses one of the other family members essentially as bait. So she kind of does turn the tables, doesn't she?
No, she just breaks out of a window and then she goes out to the road and then
Which one of the family members dies? One of the family members dies in Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
If they do, I don't think that it's because I don't think it's because she's manipulating anything.
I might have been wishful thinking about that. I thought for sure one of the other family members dies in it.
They may die, but I don't think that they die because of any sort of cleverness on her part. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I watched it pretty late, and I was very struck by how straightforward that story actually is. It's part of why it's so effective, actually, because it's relentless and it's awful. She really only gets away at the very end, like in the last minute. And even then, you're just like, oof, the therapy bills.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I
don't know. I see what you're saying about the final girl thing, sure. I don't know if I agree that the tables are always turned, though. I think that maybe you're right. I mean, in a lot of the good ones, I suppose that's an element of it. I'm not saying that she's doing anything revolutionary here. I just think that it's a solid example of a well-worn thriller story that wasn't nearly as well-worn at the time that she wrote it, which makes it even better.
If you're going to disregard the Gothic novel, yeah.
Sure, because the Gothic novel, though, wasn't doing the idea of marrying someone and then questioning.
Is. That's the entire parody of Northanger Abbey.
No, because the marriage hasn't happened yet, and nor has it happened yet in Jane Eyre.
No, but the marriage is going to happen.
And that's key.
Well,
no. That's key, though, because a key part of this genre is that
I think there's some nitpicking there. I mean,
no, it's not. Absolutely not. A key part of this genre is you thought you got the happy ending, and the story is just beginning. The story is beginning after Happily Ever After. In those Gothic novels, it's always pre-marriage. That's a different beast to this specific trope.
I suppose they're very, very much related.
Of course, they're very related. Lots to chew on there. Can I say that that's like a Halloween double entendre, like chewing on flesh?
I don't think that that's a double entendre. I think that
it's just an entendre.
Yeah, it's just an entendre.
And not a very good one. So that is our very special Halloween episode. We hope you enjoyed some of these creepier Agatha Christies for a change. Join us next week when we will be covering our next novel, Death in the Clouds. Back with our friend Monsieur Poirot. In the meantime, please do reach out and contact us. You can email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame or find Catherine at Brobcat or look us up on Instagram at allaboutagatha, and we are on Facebook. Facebook page is All About Agatha. And please take a moment to rate and review us wherever you are listening to this podcast. We very much appreciate it. It really helps us out. And we will talk to you next time. Bye.
Bye. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.